The sound of desperate knocking at 5 in the morning isn't something you forget. I'm Natalia Rivera, and 3 weeks ago, that frantic pounding on my apartment door changed everything I thought I knew about family, protection, and the quiet power that lives in shadows. When I opened it, Chloe stood there shivering in nothing but an oversized sweatshirt, her neck painted with finger-shaped bruises that told a story she didn't need to speak aloud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her frightened eyes, I saw something that reminded me of myself years ago, someone who had learned to survive by staying small, staying quiet, staying invisible. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the last decade learning a very different kind of survival. What she couldn't have known was that Marcus Thompson, the man who raised me after my parents died, had taught me something crucial before cancer took him 2 years ago. He'd said, "Natalia, there are 2 types of strength in this world, the kind that makes noise and demands attention, and the kind that moves in silence until it's time to strike. The second kind is what keeps people safe." Standing there looking at Chloe's trembling hands and purple throat, I finally understood what he meant. The rain had been falling steadily against the windows of my Pearl District apartment for hours before that knock came. Portland in October feels like the world is washing itself clean, but that morning it felt more like drowning. I'd been awake anyway, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, reviewing case files for the Community Legal Aid Center where I volunteer. The work keeps me busy, keeps my mind sharp, and most importantly, it keeps me connected to people who need help in ways that matter. When the knocking started, it wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor or the confident rhythm of a delivery person. It was the desperate, irregular beating of someone whose world was falling apart. I moved to the door without turning on the lights, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Through the peephole, I could see her hunched form, blonde hair matted against her skull from the rain, shoulders shaking with more than just cold. I recognized Chloe immediately, though I hadn't seen her in person for almost 8 months. She was my brother Derek's wife, the woman he'd introduced to our family 3 years ago with the kind of possessive pride that should have been a red flag. Back then, she'd been vibrant, confident, the type of person who lit up rooms just by entering them. The woman standing in my hallway looked like a shadow of that person. I opened the door without hesitation. Chloe practically fell into my apartment, her whole body trembling as she looked over her shoulder toward the elevator, like she expected someone to follow her. Up close, the bruises were worse than I'd initially seen. The marks around her neck were dark purple, clearly fresh, and there were older bruises on her wrists that had faded to yellow-green. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt that hung past her knees, and I could see scratches on her legs. "He's going to kill me," she whispered, her voice raw and barely audible. "Natalia, I think he's really going to kill me this time." I guided her to my couch, wrapping a soft blanket around her shoulders while my mind raced. This wasn't the first time I'd seen the signs. Working at the Legal Aid Center, I'd helped dozens of women in similar situations. But seeing it happen to someone in my own family felt different. It felt personal in a way that made my chest tight with anger. "When did this happen?" I asked gently, settling beside her but keeping enough distance that she wouldn't feel trapped. "Tonight. Last night. I don't know anymore." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "We were at his friend Tony's place for dinner. I laughed at something Tony's girlfriend said, and Derek got that look. You know the one, like I'd embarrassed him somehow." Her voice cracked. "On the way home, he started yelling about how I was flirting, how I made him look stupid. When we got to the house, he grabbed me. I knew that look she was talking about. Derek had always had a temper, even as kids, but our parents had chalked it up to him being passionate, strong-willed. They'd made excuses for behavior that, looking back, had been warning signs of something much darker. After they died in the car accident when I was 19 and Derek was 22, he'd become the man of the family by default, and I'd been too young and too grief-stricken to challenge his increasingly controlling behavior. "How long has this been happening, Chloe?" She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. It started small. He'd grab my arm too hard when he was frustrated, or he'd raise his voice and get in my face. I told myself it was stress from his job, from losing your parents, from trying to figure out adult life. Then it got worse. I'd suspected something was wrong for months. Derek had become increasingly possessive of Chloe, controlling who she spent time with, monitoring her phone, making decisions about her job and finances. At family gatherings, she'd grown quieter and more withdrawn, always looking to Derek before speaking, always apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. When I tried to talk to her privately, Derek would somehow always appear, steering the conversation away or finding reasons for them to leave early. "Where is he now?" I asked. Passed out drunk on the living room floor. I waited until I was sure he wouldn't wake up. Then I grabbed my keys and left. I didn't know where else to go. She looked at me with eyes that were desperate and hopeful at the same time. "I can't go to a hotel because he has access to our bank accounts. I can't go to my parents because they live in Minnesota and I don't have money for a plane ticket. You're the only person I could think of who might help." That statement hit me harder than it should have. The only person. It made me realize how isolated Derek had made her, how systematically he'd cut her off from support systems and independence. It was a classic pattern, one I'd seen countless times in my volunteer work, but recognizing it in my own family felt like discovering a cancer that had been growing undetected. "You can stay here as long as you need," I told her, "but we need to talk about what happens next." Chloe nodded, pulling the blanket even tighter. "I keep thinking about leaving, but then I remember how much I love him, or how much I used to love him. I don't even know the difference anymore." She paused, touching the bruises on her neck unconsciously. "He wasn't always like this. When we first met, he was charming and protective and made me feel special. He'd bring me flowers and write me notes and tell me I was the most important thing in his world." I'd heard this story before too. The love-bombing phase, the gradual escalation, the cycle of violence followed by apologies and promises to change. What made it particularly insidious was that Derek could be genuinely charming when he wanted to be. He'd learned early how to present the version of himself that people wanted to see, how to make people feel special and chosen, while slowly tightening his control around them. "Chloe, I need you to listen to me carefully," I said. "What Derek is doing isn't love. It's not passion or stress or a rough patch in your marriage. It's abuse. And it's escalating. The bruises on your neck tell me that he's getting more dangerous." She started crying then, not the dramatic sobs of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, defeated tears of someone who'd been holding back an ocean of pain. I moved closer and let her lean against me while she cried. Through her tears, she whispered things I'd heard too many times before. How she'd tried to be a better wife, how she'd stopped doing things that upset him, how she'd isolated herself from friends and family to avoid his jealousy, how she'd convinced herself that if she could just love him enough, be perfect enough, he'd go back to being the man she'd fallen in love with. While she cried, my mind was already working on a different level. Marcus had taught me to think strategically in crisis situations. He'd been a social worker before he became my guardian, and he'd seen too many cases where good intentions and emotional reactions had made dangerous situations worse. He'd taught me that helping someone meant understanding the whole system they were trapped in, not just addressing the immediate crisis. Derek wasn't just going to let Chloe disappear. He'd view her leaving as a direct challenge to his control, and men like him didn't respond to challenges with acceptance. He'd use every tool at his disposal to get her back: manipulation, emotional blackmail, threats. And if those didn't work, escalation to more serious violence. He knew where she worked, knew her routines, knew her fears and vulnerabilities. Most importantly, he knew exactly which buttons to push to make her doubt herself and return to him. But Derek also didn't know everything about me. He knew I worked part-time at a nonprofit legal aid center, but he didn't know about the network of connections I'd built there over the years. He knew I lived alone in a nice apartment, but he didn't know how I could afford it on a part-time salary. He knew I'd always been the quiet one in the family, but he'd never bothered to ask what I'd been quiet about. The truth was that Marcus had left me more than just his love and wisdom when he died. He'd been careful with money his entire life, investing in real estate and putting aside savings for the day when I might need resources to help people the way he had. The apartment was mine, bought and paid for with his life insurance money. The legal aid work was volunteer. My real income came from freelance consulting work I did for law firms, helping them research cases involving domestic violence and family law. More importantly, Marcus had introduced me to a network of people who understood that sometimes helping victims of abuse required more than just offering shelter and sympathy. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a trauma therapist who specialized in domestic violence cases. Detective James Chen, who worked in the police department's domestic violence unit and understood the limitations of the legal system. Lisa Park, a lawyer who'd built her practice around helping abuse survivors navigate the complex process of safely leaving dangerous relationships. These weren't just professional contacts. They were people who'd been changed by their work the same way I had. People who understood that sometimes the system designed to help victims actually made them more vulnerable. They taught me that effective help required patience, planning, and a deep understanding of how abusers think and operate. As Chloe's tears gradually subsided, I made coffee and sat across from her at my kitchen table. The sun was beginning to rise, casting gray light through the rain-streaked windows. She looked exhausted but more alert, like crying had cleared some of the fog of fear and shock. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," I said gently, "and I need you to answer them as honestly as you can, even if the answers are hard to say out loud."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug I'd given her. "Has Derek ever threatened to kill you specifically?" "Yes. Last month, during a fight about me getting coffee with a coworker. He said if he ever found out I was cheating on him, he'd kill me and make it look like an accident." "Has he ever shown you weapons or talked about how he would hurt you?" "He keeps a gun in his nightstand. He showed it to me once and said it was for protection, but the way he was looking at me when he said it..." She shivered. "And he's always been obsessed with those true crime shows about men who kill their wives. He makes comments about how stupid the guys were for getting caught." "Does he monitor your phone, email, or social media?" "He installed some kind of app on my phone that lets him see everything. He knows where I go, who I talk to, what I search for online. He checks my car mileage to make sure I'm not going anywhere I haven't told him about." Each answer confirmed what I already suspected. Derek wasn't just abusive. He was methodical about it. He'd studied his role, understood the tools at his disposal, and implemented a systematic approach to controlling Chloe. That made him more dangerous than men who acted purely on impulse, but it also meant his behavior followed predictable patterns. "Chloe, when you left tonight, did you bring anything with you? ID, credit cards, important documents?" She shook her head. "Just my keys and phone. I was too scared to take time looking for anything else." That was a problem. Without identification or access to money, Chloe's options were severely limited. Shelters were overcrowded and under-resourced. Staying with friends or family would put them at risk and give Derek clear targets to focus his anger on. Going through official channels, police reports, restraining orders, divorce proceedings, would create a paper trail that could escalate his violence while providing minimal actual protection. But there was another approach, one that Marcus had taught me by example rather than direct instruction. Sometimes the most effective way to protect someone was to make their abuser believe that hurting them would be more costly and dangerous than leaving them alone. It required understanding the abuser's psychology, identifying their vulnerabilities, and applying pressure in ways they wouldn't expect. Derek thought he knew me, but he'd never bothered to look beneath the surface. He saw me as his quiet little sister who worked with charity cases and lived alone with her books and causes. He had no idea that I'd spent years learning how men like him operated, building relationships with people who had the skills and resources to fight back, and quietly preparing for the day when someone I cared about might need the kind of help that went beyond emotional support and good intentions. As I watched Chloe sip her coffee and stare out at the rain-soaked city, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly, though that was there too. It was more like clarity, the feeling Marcus had described when he talked about moments when you stop reacting and start acting with purpose. "Chloe, I want you to know that you're safe here, and we're going to figure this out together. But I need you to trust me, even when you don't understand what I'm doing or why." She looked at me with those frightened eyes, and I could see her trying to decide if she was strong enough to hope. "I need you to know that Derek isn't going to just let this go. He's going to try to get you back, and he's going to use every method he can think of to make that happen. But here's what he doesn't know." I leaned forward, letting her see something in my expression that I usually kept hidden. I've been preparing for this fight a lot longer than he has. The phone started ringing at 7:30 in the morning, just as I was helping Chloe into some of my clothes. She froze when she heard it, her whole body going rigid like a deer that had caught the scent of a predator. I glanced at the caller ID and felt my jaw clench. "Derek." "Don't answer it," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't answer it." I let it ring through to voicemail, but we both knew this was just the beginning. Within minutes, it started ringing again. Then again. By the fourth call, Chloe was sitting on my bathroom floor with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. "He knows I'm here," she said. "He knows, and he's going to come here, and he's going to hurt both of us." I knelt beside her, speaking in the calm, steady voice Marcus had taught me to use in crisis situations. "Chloe, look at me. Derek doesn't know you're here. He's calling everyone he can think of because he's panicked and desperate. That's actually good news because it means he's not thinking strategically yet." But even as I said it, I was calculating. Derek was smart enough that his panic wouldn't last long. Soon, he'd start thinking more systematically about where Chloe might go and what resources she might have access to. He'd remember that I lived alone, that I'd always been sympathetic to underdogs and lost causes. My apartment would definitely be on his list of places to check. The voicemails he left were exactly what I expected. The first one was concerned and loving. "Chloe, baby, I woke up and you were gone. I'm worried sick about you. Please call me back so I know you're okay." The second was more urgent. "Chloe, this isn't funny anymore. You're scaring me. Just come home and we'll talk about whatever's bothering you." The third showed cracks in his facade. "I've been calling everyone looking for you. Nobody's seen you. Where the hell are you?" By the fifth voicemail, his mask had slipped completely. "You think you can just leave? You think you can embarrass me like this? I know you're listening to these messages wherever you are. You belong to me, Chloe. You're my wife, and you're coming home whether you want to or not. I saved every message." Marcus had taught me that abusers often revealed their true nature when they felt their control slipping, and these recordings would be valuable evidence later. But more immediately, they told me that Derek was following a predictable escalation pattern: fear, anger, threats, and then action. While Chloe showered and tried to process what was happening to her, I made a series of phone calls. The first was to Dr. Elena Vasquez, the trauma therapist who'd become both a professional colleague and a trusted friend over the years I'd been volunteering at the Legal Aid Center. "Elena, it's Natalia Rivera. I need to ask a favor, and it's urgent." "What's going on?" "My brother's wife showed up at my door this morning with strangulation marks. I need somewhere safe for her to talk to someone who understands trauma, and I need it today." Elena didn't hesitate. "Bring her to my office at 10. I'll clear my schedule." The second call was to Detective James Chen. James had worked domestic violence cases for 15 years, and he'd seen enough patterns to know that the most dangerous time for an abuse victim was the first 72 hours after leaving their abuser. He also understood that the traditional approaches, police reports, restraining orders, emergency shelters, often created more danger than protection for victims whose abusers were intelligent and methodical. "James, it's Natalia. I need to run a hypothetical situation past you." "Nothing about your hypothetical situations is ever actually hypothetical, Natalia. What's really going on?" I explained the situation with Chloe, leaving out identifying details, but giving him enough information to understand the severity of the threat. James listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. "How sophisticated is the abuser?" he asked when I finished. "Very. He's been methodical about isolating her, monitoring her activities, controlling her finances. He keeps weapons in the house and has made specific threats about killing her and making it look accidental. That's high risk. If she files a police report, he'll know within hours. Restraining orders are just pieces of paper to guys like this, and they often escalate violence instead of preventing it." "What kind of resources does she have?" "Currently, none. He controls all their finances and monitors her communications. But she has family out of state and professional skills that could help her rebuild if she can get to a safe place. She needs to disappear completely, at least for a while. New identity, new location, no contact with anyone from her old life until he stops looking for her or until we can build a case strong enough to put him away. That was what I'd expected him to say, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of the situation real. Helping Chloe wouldn't just be about providing temporary shelter and emotional support. It would require resources, planning, and a network of people willing to take risks to keep her safe. The third call was to Lisa Park, the lawyer who'd built her practice around helping abuse survivors navigate the legal system safely. Lisa had grown up in an abusive household and had dedicated her career to developing strategies that actually protected victims, instead of just following procedures that looked good on paper. Lisa, I need to know about witness relocation for domestic violence cases in Oregon. Official or unofficial? What's the difference? Official means working through the district attorney's office, which requires her abuser to be charged with a felony and her testimony to be essential for prosecution. It's rare, bureaucratic, and slow. Unofficial means private resources and networks that help people start over with new identities and locations. Tell me about unofficial. It exists, but it's expensive and complicated. You need clean documents, relocation funds, job placement assistance, and ongoing security monitoring. We're talking about $50,000 to $100,000 minimum, and that's if everything goes perfectly. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about the inheritance Marcus had left me, and the funds I'd been careful to keep liquid for exactly this kind of emergency. What if money wasn't the primary obstacle? Then we'd need to talk in person. There are people I work with who specialize in this kind of thing, but they don't advertise their services. By the time Chloe emerged from the shower, looking slightly more human in my clothes but still fragile and frightened, I had the framework of a plan. It wasn't complete yet, but it was a start. How are you feeling? I asked her. Like I'm in someone else's life. Like this is all happening to someone else, and I'm just watching it happen. She sat on my couch, pulling a throw pillow into her lap. My phone has been buzzing non-stop. I'm afraid to look at it. Don't. We're going to turn it off and put it away. Derek is using it to track your location and flood you with messages designed to make you feel guilty and scared. Right now, we need to focus on keeping you safe and getting you the help you need to make decisions about your future. What kind of decisions? Whether you want to try to work within the system, police reports, restraining orders, divorce proceedings, or whether you want to disappear completely and start over somewhere else. Chloe stared at me like I'd suggested we rob a bank. People can do that? Just disappear? With the right help and resources, yes, but it means leaving everything behind. Your job, your friends, your name, your entire life. It means accepting that you might never be able to contact people from your old life again, including family members who might get caught in the crossfire. She was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, she asked, "What would you do?" I'd want to know all my options before making a decision that big. That's why we're going to see Dr. Vasquez this morning. She'll help you work through the trauma and think clearly about what you really want for your future. The drive to Elena's office took us through downtown Portland, past the food trucks and coffee shops that made the city feel vibrant and alive. Chloe stared out the window like she was seeing the world for the first time, or maybe like she was saying goodbye to it. "Natalia, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you know about all this stuff? Witness relocation and trauma therapy and legal strategies? This isn't normal knowledge for someone who works at a legal aid center." It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. Marcus, the man who raised me after my parents died, was a social worker who specialized in family crisis intervention. He taught me that if you want to help people effectively, you have to understand the whole system they're trapped in, not just the parts that are visible on the surface. But this feels like more than just understanding the system. This feels like you've been preparing for this specific situation. She was perceptive, even in her traumatized state. Maybe I have been, without realizing it. When you grow up seeing what Derek was capable of, even before he became physically violent, you start to understand how men like him think and operate. And when you work with abuse survivors, you start to see the patterns in how these situations unfold. What I didn't tell her was that Marcus had suspected for years that Derek would eventually escalate to serious violence. He'd never said it directly, but he'd made sure I had the knowledge, resources, and connections I would need to protect myself or someone else if that day ever came. Looking back, I realized that every conversation about self-defense, every introduction to lawyers and therapists who worked with abuse survivors, every lesson about strategic thinking and long-term planning had been preparation for exactly this moment. Elena's office was in a converted house in the Hawthorne district, surrounded by gardens and designed to feel safe and welcoming rather than clinical. She met us at the door, a small woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that immediately made people feel understood. "Chloe, I'm Dr. Vasquez. Natalia has told me a little about your situation, but I'd like to hear your story in your own words." I waited in the outer office while Elena and Chloe talked, using the time to research Derek's background more thoroughly than I'd ever bothered to do before. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. 3 previous girlfriends before Chloe, all of whom had ended their relationships abruptly and refused to discuss what had happened. A pattern of workplace conflicts with female colleagues. 2 incidents in college that had been handled quietly by the administration instead of being reported to police. Most concerning was a restraining order that had been filed against him 5 years ago by a woman named Jennifer Walsh. The case had been dropped when Jennifer suddenly moved to another state, but the initial filing described escalating stalking behavior, threats of violence, and detailed knowledge of her daily routines that suggested extensive surveillance. Derek wasn't just abusive, he was experienced at it. He'd learned from his previous relationships what worked and what didn't, how to avoid leaving evidence, how to isolate his victims so completely that they felt they had no choice but to endure whatever he decided to do to them. When Chloe emerged from Elena's office 2 hours later, she looked emotionally drained but somehow more focused than she had been that morning. Elena followed her out and gestured for me to join them in her office. "Chloe has asked me to include you in our conversation about safety planning," Elena said. "She's told me about the resources you've offered and the connections you've made on her behalf." "What did you conclude about her situation?" Elena's expression was grave. "Based on the pattern of escalation she's described, the level of control he's established, and the specific nature of his threats, I believe Chloe is in extreme danger. The strangulation marks indicate that he's crossed a significant threshold. Studies show that when an abuser begins choking their victim, the likelihood of eventual homicide increases by more than 700%. Chloe flinched at this statistic, but she didn't look surprised. "He's going to kill me if I go back, isn't he?" "I think that's a very real possibility," Elena said gently, "which means that going back isn't actually an option, no matter how much easier it might seem in the short term. But staying away means giving up everything I've built in my life. My job, my friends, my home, my sense of who I am." "No," Elena said firmly. "It means choosing to build a new life instead of losing the life you have to someone who sees you as his property instead of as a human being with your own rights and value." We spent another hour discussing practical matters. Chloe would need to stay somewhere. Derek couldn't find her while we worked out longer-term plans. She would need trauma counseling to help her process what she'd been through and develop the emotional tools to rebuild her life. Most importantly, she would need to make a clean break from Derek and anyone who might pressure her to reconcile with him for the sake of family harmony or social expectations. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elena said as we prepared to leave. "Derek is going to escalate his efforts to find Chloe, and that escalation is going to include threats and manipulation directed at anyone he believes might be helping her." She was looking at me when she said this. "You need to be prepared for him to focus his anger on you, Natalia. He's going to see you as the person who took his wife away from him, and men like Derek don't handle that kind of perceived betrayal well." I nodded, thinking about the voicemails that were probably still accumulating on my phone. "I understand." "Do you?" "Because helping Chloe disappear safely isn't just going to require money and connections. It's going to require you to be willing to become a target yourself. He's my brother. He's not going to seriously hurt me." Elena and Chloe exchanged a look that made my stomach tighten. "Natalia," Chloe said quietly, "Derek doesn't think of people as family or friends or human beings. He thinks of people as things that either belong to him or things that are in his way. If he decides you're in his way. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I was beginning to understand that everything I thought I knew about Derek, everything I'd rationalized or excused over the years, had been based on the version of himself he'd chosen to show me. The real Derek, the one Chloe had been living with, was someone much more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. That afternoon, we drove to a small house in southeast Portland that Lisa Park had arranged for us to use. It belonged to a retired teacher who'd survived her own abusive marriage and now quietly helped other women in similar situations. The house was modest but comfortable, with security cameras, reinforced locks, and neighbors who understood the importance of not asking questions about temporary residents. "This is where you'll stay while we work out the details of your relocation," Lisa explained to Chloe. "The address isn't in any public records connected to you, Derek, or Natalia. The utilities are paid through a trust, and there's no paper trail that could lead him here." Chloe looked around the small living room, taking in the secondhand furniture and outdated decorations. "How long will I need to stay here?" "That depends on several factors. How quickly we can arrange your new identity documents, how thoroughly Derek searches for you, and whether he eventually gives up or whether we need to take more aggressive steps to ensure your safety." "What kind of aggressive steps?" Lisa and I had discussed this possibility during our phone conversation that morning. "If Derek becomes a credible threat to your physical safety, there are legal remedies available that go beyond restraining orders. But those remedies require evidence, and gathering that evidence safely takes time." What we didn't tell Chloe was that we were already working on gathering that evidence. The private investigator Tony Martinez was already conducting surveillance on Derek, documenting his activities and looking for patterns that might give us leverage. Dr. Vasquez was preparing a psychological evaluation that would support Chloe's credibility if she ever needed to testify about the abuse. Detective Chen was quietly reviewing Derek's background for any previous incidents that might have been overlooked or inadequately investigated. Most importantly, I was documenting everything. Every voicemail, every text message, every attempt Derek made to locate or contact Chloe was being recorded and stored in multiple locations. If he escalated to direct threats or violence, we would have the evidence needed to pursue serious criminal charges. As evening fell and we settled Chloe into her temporary safe house, my phone finally rang with the call I'd been expecting all day. "Derek." "Natalia, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day." His voice was strained but controlled, the tone of someone working hard to sound reasonable and concerned. "Have you seen Chloe? She disappeared sometime during the night and I'm worried sick about her." "No, Derek, I haven't seen her." "What happened?" "I don't know. We had a small disagreement last night, nothing serious, and this morning she was just gone. I thought maybe she'd called you or come by your place." "What kind of disagreement?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear him calculating how much to admit. "Just stupid married couple stuff. She was upset about something at work, and I was trying to help her figure out how to handle it. You know how emotional she gets." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I could see how Chloe had been manipulated into doubting her own perceptions and memories. Derek wasn't just lying about what had happened. He was rewriting reality to make himself the reasonable, concerned husband, and Chloe the unstable, overly emotional wife who'd blown a minor disagreement out of proportion. "I'm sure she'll come home when she's ready to talk," I said carefully. "That's what I'm hoping, but Natalia, I'm really worried about her mental state lately. She's been having mood swings, talking about how everyone is against her, getting paranoid about normal things. I think she might need professional help." This was the setup. Derek was establishing a narrative that would discredit anything Chloe might say about him later. If she came forward with accusations of abuse, he could point to her, quote, "history of mental instability," and, quote, "pattern of making false accusations when she was upset. That must be really difficult for both of you." "It is. And I'm wondering if maybe you've noticed any changes in her behavior when you've seen her recently." I almost laughed at the transparency of it. He was fishing for information about when and where I might have seen Chloe, while simultaneously trying to get me to corroborate his story about her mental state. "I haven't seen much of Chloe lately, Derek. You know how busy I've been with work." Another pause. "Right. Well, if you do hear from her, will you please let me know immediately? I just want to make sure she's safe." "Of course." After I hung up, I sat in my car outside the safe house for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about Derek's strategy. He was already several steps ahead, laying groundwork for a narrative that would protect him if Chloe ever tried to expose what he'd done to her. He was also probing for information about my involvement while trying to recruit me as an ally in his version of events. But Derek had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed that I would believe his story because I'd always been willing to make excuses for his behavior in the past. He assumed that blood loyalty would trump my judgment, and that I would choose family harmony over protecting Chloe. What he didn't understand was that Marcus had taught me to recognize manipulation, even when it came from people I loved. What he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of situation for years, building the knowledge and connections I would need to fight back effectively when the time came. Most importantly, Derek didn't know that I'd already chosen a side in this conflict, and it wasn't his. The surveillance footage arrived on Thursday morning, 3 days after Chloe had disappeared from Derek's house. Tony Martinez had been watching Derek's movements since Tuesday, documenting everything from his daily routines to the increasingly erratic patterns that suggested a man whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. I sat in my apartment reviewing the digital files Tony had uploaded to our secure server. Derek had visited my building twice, both times late at night when he thought I wouldn't notice. The first time, he'd sat in his car across the street for over an hour, watching the windows of my apartment. The second time, he'd actually entered the building, somehow bypassing the security door, and spent 20 minutes in the lobby examining the mailboxes and elevator access. More disturbing was the footage from Chloe's workplace. Derek had shown up there Wednesday morning, presenting himself as the concerned husband looking for his missing wife. He'd spoken to her supervisor, her co-workers, anyone who might have information about where she'd gone. According to the audio Tony had captured, Derek's story was polished and believable. Chloe had been struggling with depression and anxiety, he explained. She'd been having episodes where she disappeared for days at a time, worrying everyone who cared about her. The most chilling part was watching Derek's performance. He knew exactly which emotions to display, exactly how much distress to show without appearing unstable himself. He painted himself as the devoted husband desperately trying to help his mentally ill wife, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about anything Chloe might say if she tried to tell people what had really happened to her. But Derek had made several mistakes that Tony's cameras had captured. When he thought no one was watching, his mask slipped completely. Outside Chloe's office building, waiting for the elevator, his face had transformed into something cold and calculating. He'd made phone calls where his voice carried a tone of barely controlled rage, talking to someone about teaching her a lesson about embarrassing him, and, quote, making sure she understood the consequences of running away. Most importantly, Derek had visited 3 locations that revealed the scope of his surveillance network. He'd gone to a private investigation firm downtown, the same one Jennifer Walsh had mentioned in her restraining order filing. He'd stopped by an electronics store that specialized in surveillance equipment. And he'd met with someone at a gun range, spending over an hour in what appeared to be an intense conversation. I forwarded the most relevant footage to Detective Chen with a message asking for his professional assessment. His response came back within an hour, and it confirmed my worst fears. This isn't just domestic violence escalation. This is stalking behavior with potential for serious violence. The surveillance equipment purchases suggest he's planning to track her long-term. The gun range visit indicates he's considering lethal force. You need to assume he's armed and extremely dangerous. Dr. Vasquez had been working with Chloe daily, helping her process the trauma, while also preparing her psychologically for the reality that Derek wouldn't simply accept her decision to leave. During one of their sessions, Chloe had remembered something that sent chills through all of us. "He used to have these fantasies," she told Elena, with me present at her request. He'd described scenarios where I died in accidents, car crashes, falls downstairs, drowning in the bathtub. He always presented them like he was worried about my safety, like he was just being protective. But the way he described them, with so much detail, it felt like he'd thought about them a lot. Elena had explained that this was a common pattern among abusers who eventually escalate to murder. They rehearse scenarios mentally, working through the details until violence becomes normalized in their thinking. When they finally act, it's not a crime of passion, but the execution of a plan they've been developing for months or years. "Did he ever ask you about your daily routines?" Elena asked. "Times when you'd be alone, places you went regularly, people who might miss you if you didn't show up?" Chloe nodded slowly. "All the time. He said he worried about my safety, especially when I had to work late or meet clients at remote locations. He wanted to know exactly where I'd be and when I'd be back. If I was even a few minutes late, he'd call repeatedly until I answered." This wasn't just control, it was reconnaissance. Derek had been mapping Chloe's life, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities. The fact that she'd escaped his monitoring system by coming to me was probably driving him to increasingly desperate measures. Lisa Park had been working on the legal aspects of Chloe's situation, and the news wasn't encouraging. Oregon's domestic violence laws were stronger than those in many states, but they still required victims to navigate a system that often put them in more danger rather than protecting them. If Chloe files for a restraining order, Derek will be served with papers that include her temporary address. Lisa explained during our meeting at her office. That gives him a legal roadmap to find her. If she files for divorce, the same thing happens. Plus, he gets access to discovery that could reveal her financial resources and support network. What about the evidence we're gathering? The surveillance footage, the recordings of his threats, Chloe's medical documentation of the abuse? It's all helpful, but Oregon requires a very high standard of proof for domestic violence charges that carry serious penalties. Unless Derek actually attacks someone or makes explicit death threats that can be clearly documented, the most we can do is get him charged with harassment or stalking, which are misdemeanors. And misdemeanor charges won't stop someone who's planning murder. Exactly. In fact, they often escalate the situation because the abuser feels cornered and desperate. Lisa had been exploring alternatives to the traditional legal approach. There were federal programs for witness protection, but they required Chloe to be a witness in a major criminal case, which she wasn't. There were private security firms that specialized in protecting domestic violence survivors, but they were expensive and only provided temporary solutions. The most realistic option was what Lisa called strategic disappearance. This involved creating a new identity for Chloe, relocating her to a different state, and providing her with the resources to start over completely. It was legal, but it required careful coordination and significant financial resources. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. $50,000 for clean identity documents, another $30,000 for relocation and setup costs, plus ongoing living expenses until she can establish herself in a new location. And that assumes everything goes smoothly. I thought about the inheritance Marcus had left me, money I'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. $80,000 was a significant sum, but it wasn't impossible. What worried me more was the ongoing danger to everyone involved in helping Chloe escape. "Lisa, what happens to the people who help her disappear? How much risk are we taking on personally?" Her expression grew serious. "If Derek finds out who helped Chloe, and if he's as dangerous as the evidence suggests, then everyone involved becomes a potential target. That includes you, me, Elena, Detective Chen, and anyone else who's part of this network." "Are you saying we should stop helping her?" "I'm saying we need to be realistic about what we're getting ourselves into. This isn't just about saving Chloe anymore. It's about protecting ourselves and making sure Derek doesn't hurt anyone else in the process." That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything we'd learned about Derek's escalating behavior and trying to decide how far I was willing to go to protect Chloe. The rational part of my mind understood that I was putting myself and others at risk by continuing to help her. The emotional part of me remembered the terror in her eyes when she'd arrived at my door, and I knew I couldn't abandon her just because helping her was dangerous. Marcus had faced similar decisions during his career as a social worker. He'd told me stories about cases where protecting a client had required him to take personal risks, to challenge powerful people, to make enemies of individuals who could have made his life very difficult. When I'd asked him how he decided when the risk was worth it, he'd said something I'd never forgotten. "Natalia, there are moments when you have to choose between being safe and being decent. If you always choose safety, you'll end up living in a world where decent people are extinct." My phone rang just after midnight, jolting me awake from dreams filled with surveillance footage and Derek's cold eyes. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. "Natalia, it's me." Chloe's voice was barely a whisper. "Something's wrong. I think he found me." I was instantly alert, grabbing clothes and shoes while keeping the phone pressed to my ear. What happened? I was sleeping, and I heard a car door slam outside. When I looked out the window, there was someone sitting in a dark sedan across the street. They've been there for over an hour, just watching the house. "Are you sure it's Derek?" "I can't see clearly enough to tell, but who else would it be?" "I'm scared, Natalia. What if he's planning to break in?" I was already in my car, driving through the empty Portland streets toward the safe house. "Listen to me carefully, Chloe. Go to the back bedroom and lock the door. There's a phone in the nightstand that connects directly to a security company. If anyone tries to enter the house, press the red button, and they'll dispatch police immediately." "Where are you?" "On my way. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The drive felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. If Derek had found Chloe, it meant our security had been compromised somehow. Either he'd been more thorough in his investigation than we'd realized, or someone had given him information about where she was staying. When I turned onto the quiet residential street where the safe house was located, I immediately saw the dark sedan Chloe had described. It was parked under a broken streetlight, positioned to have a clear view of the house while remaining partially hidden in shadows. I drove past without slowing down, noting the license plate and trying to get a look at whoever was inside. I parked 3 blocks away and called Detective Chen, knowing I was waking him up but not caring about the late hour. "James, it's Natalia. Derek found Chloe's location. There's someone conducting surveillance on the safe house right now. Are you certain it's Derek?" "I'm not certain of anything, but there's a vehicle that's been watching the house for over an hour." Chloe is terrified, and frankly, so am I. "Give me the address and the license plate number. I'll run it through our system and see if I can get a patrol car to do a welfare check." What if it is Derek? What if confronting him escalates the situation? If it's Derek, then he's already escalated the situation by tracking down her location. At least this way we'll have documentation of his stalking behavior. While I waited for James to call back, I positioned myself where I could watch both the safe house and the suspicious vehicle. After about 20 minutes, I saw movement. The car's engine started, and it began driving slowly down the street, passing the safe house twice, before parking in a different location with an even better view of the front door. Whoever was in that car wasn't just watching randomly. They were conducting systematic surveillance, adjusting their position to maintain optimal visibility while avoiding detection. This was professional-level stalking behavior, the kind that suggested extensive planning and preparation. My phone buzzed with a text from James. License plate registered to vehicle rental company. Rented Tuesday morning by Derek Patterson using cash deposit. 2 patrol units en route. Derek had found her. Despite all our precautions, despite the careful planning and security measures, he'd managed to track Chloe to what was supposed to be a secure location. That meant our entire operation was compromised, and everyone involved was now at risk. The patrol cars arrived with their lights off, approaching from different directions to prevent the suspect from fleeing easily. I watched as 2 officers got out and approached the sedan, flashlights illuminating the interior. There was a brief conversation, then the driver's door opened. Even from a distance, I recognized Derek's tall frame and confident posture as he stepped out of the car. He appeared calm and cooperative, speaking to the officers with the same reasonable demeanor he'd used on the phone with me. I knew he was spinning some story about being concerned for his missing wife, presenting himself as the worried husband rather than the stalking predator. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, with Derek gesturing toward the safe house, and showing the officers what looked like a photograph, probably of Chloe. One of the officers walked up to the front door of the house and knocked, while the other continued talking to Derek. I could see lights coming on inside the safe house, and I knew Chloe was probably terrified, as she realized that Derek had not only found her, but was now talking to police officers just outside her temporary refuge. The whole situation felt like it was spiraling beyond our control. After another few minutes, both officers returned to Derek's car. They spoke briefly, then got back in their patrol vehicles and drove away. Derek stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking directly at the safe house, then got back in his car and drove off in the opposite direction. My phone rang immediately. "He's gone," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "But Natalia, he was right there. He was talking to the police like he had every right to be watching this house. What did he tell them?" "I don't know, but we need to get you out of there immediately. Pack only what you absolutely need. I'll pick you up in 5 minutes." "Where will we go?" "Somewhere Derek can't find you while we figure out our next move." As I drove toward the safe house, I realized that we'd reached a turning point in this situation. Derek had demonstrated that he could find Chloe no matter where we hid her, and that he was willing to escalate his stalking behavior even when it involved confronting police officers. The traditional approaches, safe houses, restraining orders, working within the legal system, weren't going to be sufficient to protect her. We needed a different strategy, one that didn't depend on hiding from Derek, but instead made it too costly and dangerous for him to continue pursuing Chloe. That meant shifting from defense to offense, using the evidence we'd been gathering to build a case that could put him in prison before he had a chance to hurt her. But it also meant accepting that we were now in an active conflict with someone who had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. Everyone who had helped Chloe was now a potential target, and Derek had shown that he was skilled at gathering information and tracking people's movements. When I pulled up to the safe house, Chloe was waiting by the door with a small bag containing her few possessions. She looked exhausted and defeated, like someone who'd been running for so long that she couldn't imagine ever feeling safe again. "I'm sorry," she said as she got in the car. "I'm sorry for bringing all this danger into your life." "You didn't bring danger into my life, Chloe. Derek did. And we're going to stop him before he hurts you or anyone else." "How?" "He found me at a place that was supposed to be completely secure. He's always one step ahead of us. Because we've been playing defense. It's time to change the game." As we drove through the dark Portland streets, I thought about Marcus and the lessons he'd taught me about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes being decent meant accepting danger. Sometimes helping someone required you to risk everything you'd built in your own life. But Marcus had also taught me that intelligent people didn't take unnecessary risks. They calculated odds, prepared contingencies, and made sure that when they committed to a course of action, they had the resources and support necessary to see it through to the end. Derek thought he was hunting Chloe, but he'd made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that the people helping her were amateurs who would be intimidated by his escalating behavior. He'd underestimated the network we'd built, the evidence we'd been gathering, and most importantly, my willingness to use every resource at my disposal to protect someone I cared about. It was time for Derek to learn that he wasn't the only one in this family who understood how to plan strategically and execute with precision. The trap was set by Friday afternoon. Detective Chen had coordinated with the district attorney's office to arrange a controlled operation that would give Derek enough rope to hang himself legally. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences for my brother. Tony Martinez had been monitoring Derek's communications through methods I didn't ask him to explain in detail. What we'd learned was that Derek had been in contact with the private investigation firm Jennifer Walsh had mentioned, and they'd provided him with Chloe's location at the safe house. More importantly, they'd given him detailed information about everyone in our support network, including my home address, work schedule, and daily routines. Derek wasn't just hunting Chloe anymore. He was planning something that involved all of us, and the communications Tony had intercepted suggested it would happen soon. Dr. Vasquez had worked with Chloe to prepare her psychologically for what was coming. The controlled operation would require Chloe to act as bait, appearing vulnerable and isolated, while actually being surrounded by law enforcement officers who could intervene the moment Derek crossed the line from stalking into attempted violence. "I need you to understand the risks," Elena had explained to Chloe during their final preparation session. "If Derek is as dangerous as we believe, he might escalate immediately to lethal force. The officers will be positioned to intervene quickly, but there's always a chance that something could go wrong." Chloe had been quiet for a long time before responding. "What's the alternative? Spend the rest of my life running from him, never knowing when he might find me again? At least this way, if something happens to me, there will be witnesses and evidence." Lisa Park had spent the week working with federal prosecutors to ensure that if Derek fell into our trap, the charges would be serious enough to put him away for years rather than months. The federal angle came from Derek's use of interstate resources to stalk Chloe, including hiring investigators who operated across state lines and using electronic surveillance tools that violated federal privacy laws. If we can document him attempting to commit violence against Chloe, especially if he uses weapons or surveillance equipment we can prove he purchased specifically for stalking her, we're looking at federal charges that carry 20-year minimum sentences, Lisa had explained, but it all depends on getting him to act while we're recording everything. The location we'd chosen was perfect for our purposes. Riverside Park along the Willamette River had multiple entry and exit points, clear sight lines for surveillance equipment, and enough foot traffic that Derek wouldn't be suspicious about Chloe being there. Most importantly, it was a public space where law enforcement could justify their presence without alerting Derek to the fact that he was walking into a trap. Detective Chen had positioned undercover officers throughout the park, each equipped with cameras and recording equipment that would capture everything Derek said and did. Snipers were hidden in the trees along the riverbank, close enough to intervene if Derek produced a weapon. Additional officers were stationed at every exit point to prevent him from fleeing if he realized what was happening. The message that would lure Derek to the park came from Chloe's phone, sent from a location that would make him believe she was alone and desperate. The text was carefully crafted to trigger his need for control, while giving him confidence that he could overpower her physically. "Derek, I can't keep running. I'm tired and scared, and I don't know what to do anymore. Meet me at Riverside Park by the Hawthorne Bridge at sunset. I want to come home, but I need to know that you won't hurt me again. Please, I just want this nightmare to be over." Tony Martinez had been monitoring Derek's location when the message was sent, and his reaction was immediate. Derek had been at his house, apparently pacing and making phone calls, when his phone buzzed with Chloe's text. According to Tony's report, Derek had actually pumped his fist in the air and shouted something that sounded like victory celebration. Within minutes, Derek was in his car, driving toward the park. But instead of going directly there, he made several stops that revealed the extent of his preparation. He visited his bank and withdrew a large amount of cash. He stopped at the electronics store where he'd purchased surveillance equipment earlier in the week. Most ominously, he made a brief stop at his house, emerging with a large duffel bag that he placed in his trunk. "He's bringing tools," Tony reported over the radio. "Unknown contents, but the bag appears heavy, and he's handling it carefully." Detective Chen's voice came through the communication system, calm and professional. "All units, suspect is en route to the target location. He appears to be armed and has demonstrated planning and premeditation. Treat this as an extremely high-risk operation. I was positioned in an unmarked surveillance van parked 2 blocks from the park, monitoring the operation through live feeds from multiple cameras. Chloe was already in position on a bench near the river, wearing a wire that would record everything Derek said to her. She looked small and vulnerable sitting there, exactly the image we wanted Derek to see. Dr. Vasquez was in the van with me, monitoring Chloe's stress levels through biometric equipment attached to the wire she was wearing. If Chloe's heart rate or breathing indicated that she was in immediate danger, Elena could recommend that the officers intervene before Derek had a chance to incriminate himself fully. "How are you holding up?" Elena asked me as we watched Derek's car appear on the surveillance feeds. "I keep thinking about all the times I made excuses for his behavior growing up, all the signs I ignored or rationalized away." I watched Derek get out of his car and scan the park methodically, like a predator surveying territory. Part of me still can't believe he's capable of murder. The evidence suggests otherwise. And more importantly, Chloe believes he's capable of it. Trust her judgment over your family loyalty. Derek approached the park cautiously, clearly aware that he might be walking into some kind of trap but too arrogant to believe that Chloe could have outsmarted him. He'd brought backup equipment, including what looked like a small device for detecting electronic surveillance, but the police equipment was too sophisticated for him to identify from a distance. When Derek spotted Chloe on the bench, his whole demeanor changed. The careful, predatory scan of his environment was replaced by focused intensity. He walked directly toward her, with the confident stride of someone who knew he was about to regain control of a situation that had been spiraling away from him. The conversation that followed was recorded from multiple angles and would eventually be played in a federal courtroom, but watching it unfold in real time was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. Derek didn't approach Chloe with relief or concern or even anger. He approached her with ownership. "I knew you'd come to your senses eventually," Derek said as he sat down beside her on the bench. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made my skin crawl. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Chloe. A lot of people are going to have to pay for that." "I just want this to stop," Chloe replied, her voice shaking convincingly. "I want to come home, but Derek, I need to know that things will be different." Derek laughed, and the sound was cold enough to make Elena grab my arm. "Different? You think you're in a position to negotiate terms? You embarrassed me, Chloe. You made me look weak in front of people. That has consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out a small electronic device that looked like a GPS tracker. "First, you're going to wear this so I always know exactly where you are. Second, you're going to give me the names of everyone who helped you run away from me. All of them." "Derek," I was scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. "You were thinking clearly enough to plan this whole thing. You were thinking clearly enough to disappear in the middle of the night and hide from me for a week. You were thinking clearly enough to get other people involved in our marriage." Derek's voice was rising, and I could see the officers positioned around the park tensing in preparation for intervention. "I didn't get other people involved. I just needed somewhere safe to stay while I figured things out." "Bullshit." Derek grabbed Chloe's wrist and I could see her flinch from the pressure. "I know you've been staying with my sister. I know you've been talking to lawyers and therapists and probably the police too. You think I'm stupid?" This was the moment we'd been waiting for. Derek had just admitted to stalking Chloe and conducting surveillance on our activities, while simultaneously demonstrating possessive and threatening behavior toward her in a public place. The federal prosecutors watching the live feed would have everything they needed to file serious charges. But Derek wasn't finished. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a pair of handcuffs, placing them on his lap where Chloe could see them clearly. "Here's what's going to happen," Derek said, his voice now completely devoid of the fake warmth he'd used initially. "You're going to walk with me to my car, very calmly and quietly. If you make a scene, if you try to run, if you do anything I don't like, people are going to get hurt. Starting with my dear sister Natalia. Derek, please don't involve her. She was just trying to help me. She involved herself when she decided to interfere in my marriage. And now she's going to learn what happens to people who try to take things that belong to me." Derek stood up and grabbed Chloe's arm, pulling her to her feet with enough force that she stumbled. The handcuffs were now clearly visible in his other hand, and his intentions were unmistakable. This wasn't just stalking or domestic violence anymore. This was kidnapping in progress, with implied threats of violence against multiple victims. Detective Chen's voice came through the radio system, calm but urgent. "All units, suspect is attempting to abduct the victim. Move in now." The officers hidden throughout the park emerged simultaneously from multiple directions, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. Derek's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of showing surprise or confusion like an innocent person might, he immediately positioned Chloe as a human shield while reaching for something in his jacket. "Nobody move or she dies," Derek shouted, and I could see that he was holding a knife against Chloe's throat. I'll cut her right here in front of all of you. The standoff lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Derek was surrounded by law enforcement officers, caught in the act of attempted kidnapping, with hours of recorded evidence documenting his stalking behavior and threats of violence. He had no escape route and no leverage except for the knife he was holding against Chloe's neck. But Derek had made one final miscalculation. The snipers positioned in the trees along the riverbank had clear shots, and they'd been listening to Derek threaten to kill both Chloe and me for the past 10 minutes. When Derek raised the knife as if to follow through on his threat, they didn't hesitate. The single shot was precisely placed and immediately effective. Derek collapsed to the ground, the knife spinning away across the pavement. Chloe fell to her knees beside him, not out of concern but out of shock and relief that the nightmare was finally over. Paramedics were on scene within minutes, but Derek's wound was severe enough that he was unconscious and would require emergency surgery. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Detective Chen walked over to where I was standing. "It's over, Natalia. He's going to survive, but when he wakes up, he'll be under arrest for attempted kidnapping, stalking, making terroristic threats, and federal charges related to interstate stalking. Even if he recovers completely, he's looking at 25 years minimum in federal prison." I should have felt relief, or satisfaction, or at least closure. Instead, I felt hollow. Derek was my brother, and despite everything he'd done, watching him get shot while trying to kidnap his wife wasn't something I could celebrate. Dr. Vasquez appeared beside me as the ambulance drove away. "How are you processing all this?" I keep thinking about the Derek I knew growing up, the one who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework. I can't reconcile that person with what just happened here. The person who taught you to ride a bike was real. So was the person who just threatened to murder you and kidnap Chloe. People are complex, and sometimes the complexity includes the capacity for terrible things. Over the following hours, as statements were taken and evidence was processed, the full scope of Derek's planning became clear. The duffel bag he'd brought to the park contained not just handcuffs and knives, but detailed maps of my apartment building, Chloe's workplace, and the locations of everyone who'd helped her escape from him. He'd also brought a substantial amount of cash and what appeared to be forged identification documents, suggesting that he'd been planning to flee the area after whatever he'd intended to do to us. Most disturbing was a notebook containing detailed descriptions of the violence he'd been fantasizing about inflicting on Chloe, me, and others in our support network. The entries went back months, indicating that Derek had been planning systematic revenge against anyone who interfered with his control over Chloe long before she actually left him. The federal prosecutors reviewed all the evidence and agreed that Derek would face charges serious enough to ensure he'd spend the rest of his productive life in prison, assuming he survived his injuries. The gunshot had caused significant internal damage, and doctors weren't certain about his long-term prognosis. 3 days after the shooting, Derek regained consciousness in the prison ward of the hospital. His first words, according to the guards stationed outside his room, were asking when he could see me. When told that he was under arrest and facing federal charges, his response was to demand that his lawyers contact me about posting bail. Even lying in a hospital bed with a breathing tube and multiple surgical wounds, Derek apparently still believed that family loyalty would override everything he'd done. He still thought I would choose him over protecting the woman he'd tried to kidnap and murder. Detective Chen brought me the message Derek had dictated for his lawyers to pass along. "Tell Natalia that I forgive her for getting confused about whose side she should be on. Family is family, and when this misunderstanding gets cleared up, we'll go back to normal." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to understand how someone could be so completely disconnected from reality. Derek had been caught on camera attempting to kidnap his wife while threatening to murder multiple people, and he still thought of it as a misunderstanding that would be cleared up through normal legal processes. Does he really not understand what he did? I asked Detective Chen. Men like Derek often have a fundamental inability to recognize that other people have rights that supersede their desires. In his mind, Chloe belonged to him, and everyone who helped her was stealing his property. The law, the courts, the police, they're all just obstacles preventing him from reclaiming what he believes is rightfully his. Chloe spent several days in the hospital as well, Not because of physical injuries, but because the psychological trauma of the final confrontation had triggered what Dr. Vasquez described as acute stress reaction. She'd held herself together through weeks of terror and danger. But now that the immediate threat was over, her mind and body were processing everything that had happened. When I visited her in the hospital, she looked smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But there was something different in her eyes. The constant fear that had defined her for months was gone, replaced by a kind of exhausted peace. "Is it really over?" she asked me. "Derek is going to prison for a very long time, Chloe. Even if he gets early parole for good behavior, he'll be an old man by the time he gets out. And there will be restraining orders and federal monitoring that will prevent him from contacting you even after he's released. I keep thinking I should feel sorry for him. He's your brother, and he might die from his injuries. Derek chose everything that happened to him. You didn't make him stalk you, or threaten to kill you, or try to kidnap you. Those were his decisions, and now he's facing the consequences of those decisions. Do you feel sorry for him?" I thought about the question for a long time before answering. I feel sorry for the person he could have been if he'd made different choices, but I don't feel sorry for the person he chose to become. The legal proceedings stretched on for months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Derek's defense attorneys tried to argue that he'd been suffering from mental illness, that the stress of his wife leaving him had triggered a psychological breakdown that made him not responsible for his actions. The federal prosecutors demolished this defense by presenting evidence that Derek's stalking and violence had been planned and systematic rather than impulsive. The notebook full of violent fantasies, the surveillance equipment purchases, the coordination with private investigators, the careful planning of the attempted kidnapping, all of it demonstrated that Derek had been fully conscious and deliberate in his actions. This wasn't mental illness, it was criminal behavior by someone who'd been escalating toward violence for years. Derek eventually pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, accepting a sentence of life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The plea agreement included provisions that prevented him from contacting Chloe, me, or anyone else who'd been involved in helping her escape from him. On the day of Derek's sentencing, Chloe asked if I wanted to attend the hearing. I declined. I had already said everything I needed to say to Derek, and hearing him sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison wasn't going to bring me closure or satisfaction. Instead, I spent that day helping Chloe pack for her move to a new city where she could start over completely. The Federal Witness Protection Program had offered her a new identity and relocation assistance, but she'd decided she wanted to rebuild her life using her own name and resources. I spent so many years being afraid of Derek that I forgot who I was when I wasn't scared, she told me as we loaded boxes into her car. I want to remember what it feels like to make decisions based on what I want instead of what might keep me safe. The last conversation I had with Derek was through his lawyer, who called to ask if I would consider visiting Derek in prison. Derek apparently still believed that our family relationship meant something, that given enough time and the right words, he could convince me that what had happened was somehow a misunderstanding. I told the lawyer that Derek and I had no relationship anymore, family or otherwise. The person I'd grown up with, the brother I'd loved despite his flaws, had been replaced by someone capable of planning to murder innocent people. That person was a stranger to me, and I had no interest in getting to know him better. As I hung up the phone, I thought about Marcus and the lessons he'd taught me about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes being decent meant accepting danger. Sometimes helping someone required you to risk everything you'd built in your own life. But Marcus had also taught me that some choices were permanent, that some actions changed people so fundamentally that there was no going back to who they used to be. Derek had made his choice, and now everyone who'd known him had to live with the consequences of that choice. The brother I'd grown up with was gone, replaced by someone who'd chosen violence and control over love and respect. I would mourn the person he used to be, but I wouldn't waste any more energy trying to save the person he'd become. 2 years after Derek was sentenced to life in prison, I stood in the cemetery where Marcus was buried, holding a letter that had arrived that morning. The return address showed Oregon State Penitentiary, and Derek's name was written in the careful block letters he'd always used when he wanted to appear reasonable and controlled. I hadn't opened it yet. In the 24 months since Derek had been locked away, he'd sent me dozens of letters, each one following the same pattern. First came apologies that sounded sincere until you realized they were actually blame disguised as remorse. Then came explanations about how the stress of losing our parents had affected his judgment, how Chloe's mental instability had driven him to desperate measures, how the legal system had misunderstood his intentions. Finally came the requests for money, for legal assistance, for family loyalty that transcended whatever misunderstandings had led to his current situation. I'd stopped reading them after the first few, but I'd kept every one. Dr. Vasquez had explained that maintaining documentation of Derek's continued attempts to manipulate and control people from prison might be important if he ever came up for parole review, or if he found ways to threaten Chloe or me through intermediaries. Standing beside Marcus's grave, I thought about the conversation we'd had years ago about the difference between being safe and being decent. Marcus had chosen decency over safety many times during his career, and it had cost him relationships, job opportunities, and sometimes his physical well-being. But he died knowing that he'd used his life to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I opened Derek's latest letter, scanning the familiar handwriting and predictable content. This one was different, though. Instead of apologies and explanations, it was filled with rage and accusations. Derek had apparently learned that Chloe was engaged to be married to a man she'd met in her new city. Someone had shown him a newspaper announcement that included a photo of Chloe smiling beside her fiancé, looking happy and peaceful in a way I'd never seen during her marriage to Derek. The letter was filled with threats and promises of revenge. Derek wrote about how he would find a way to escape from prison, how he would track down Chloe and her new fiancé, how he would make everyone who'd interfered with his marriage pay for what they'd done to him. The writing grew increasingly erratic as the letter continued, with underlined words and phrases that revealed the depth of Derek's continuing obsession. Most disturbing was the final paragraph, where Derek wrote that he'd been in contact with people on the outside who shared his views about women who abandoned their marriages and the people who helped them. He hinted at a network of men who'd been wrongfully imprisoned for domestic violence charges, men who supported each other's plans for revenge against the people who'd put them behind bars. I folded the letter and placed it in my jacket pocket. This wasn't the desperate plea of a man who'd accepted the consequences of his actions. This was the manifesto of someone who'd spent 2 years in prison nurturing his anger and planning future violence. Derek hadn't been reformed by incarceration. He'd been radicalized by it. The next morning, I called Detective Chen to discuss the letter and what it might mean for Chloe's safety. James had retired from active duty but still consulted on domestic violence cases, and he'd been following Derek's situation since the trial. "We've been tracking communications from several inmates at Oregon State Penitentiary," James told me. "There's a group of men serving time for domestic violence and stalking charges who've been corresponding with each other and with people outside the prison. They call themselves a support group, but the content of their communications suggests they're actually planning coordinated harassment and potentially violence against their former victims and the people who helped convict them. Is Derek part of this group? He appears to be one of the leaders." Prison officials have intercepted dozens of letters between Derek and other inmates, as well as communications with people outside the prison who've been researching the current locations and activities of various women and their support networks. What can be done about it? Officially, not much. The letters don't contain explicit threats that meet the legal standard for additional criminal charges. Unofficially, we're monitoring the situation and maintaining communication with potential targets. Potential targets like Chloe and me, among others. Natalia, I need you to understand that Derek's network has been very sophisticated in their information gathering. They know where Chloe lives, where she works, who she's engaged to, and details about her daily routines. They also have current information about your activities, your residence, and the people you associate with. This news hit me like a physical blow. I'd assumed that Derek's imprisonment had ended the danger to Chloe and everyone who'd helped her. Learning that he'd actually expanded his network and his surveillance capabilities while incarcerated was terrifying in ways I hadn't prepared for. What do you recommend? Enhanced security measures for both you and Chloe. Professional security assessments of your homes and workplaces. Consider relocating if possible. And most importantly, assume that Derek's network is monitoring your communications and activities. After hanging up with James, I immediately called Chloe. She was at work at a nonprofit organization that helped abuse survivors, the career she'd chosen after rebuilding her life. When I explained about Derek's letter and the information James had shared, Chloe was quiet for a long time. "I thought it was over," she finally said. "I thought I could finally stop looking over my shoulder and just live my life normally. Maybe we can still make that happen. But it's going to require us to be proactive instead of just reactive." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's time to stop waiting for Derek to make the next move and start taking action to neutralize the threat he represents." That afternoon, I drove to Lisa Park's law office to discuss options for dealing with Derek's continuing threats from prison. Lisa had maintained her practice representing domestic violence survivors, and she'd become nationally recognized for her innovative approaches to protecting clients from abusers who continued their harassment and intimidation tactics, even while incarcerated. "The prison-to-community stalking network is a growing problem," Lisa explained as we reviewed Derek's letter and the intelligence James had shared. "Men who are incarcerated for domestic violence often use their prison time to network with other abusers, sharing techniques and resources for continuing to terrorize their victims from behind bars. But Derek is serving life without parole. How much damage can he realistically do?" "More than you might think. These networks often involve people on the outside who are willing to conduct surveillance, harassment, and even violence on behalf of incarcerated members. Derek might not be able to physically harm Chloe himself, but he could potentially coordinate attacks through intermediaries." "What legal remedies are available?" "Limited ones. Derek's letters don't contain explicit enough threats to warrant additional criminal charges. However, there are civil remedies available that might be more effective than traditional criminal prosecution." Lisa explained that we could file a federal civil rights lawsuit against Derek, the other members of his prison network, and any outside associates who were participating in the ongoing harassment and stalking of Chloe. Civil lawsuits had a lower burden of proof than criminal cases, and they could result in financial judgments that would make it costly for Derek's network to continue their activities. "More importantly," Lisa added, "civil discovery processes would give us access to Derek's communications, financial records, and associate networks in ways that criminal investigations cannot. We could map out his entire operation and identify everyone involved." "How long would a lawsuit like that take?" "Months to years, depending on how aggressively Derek's network fights the process. But we could seek immediate injunctive relief that would legally prohibit Derek and his associates from any form of communication about Chloe, and we could potentially freeze any financial resources they're using to fund their activities." The idea of spending years embroiled in legal proceedings with Derek was exhausting to contemplate, but it seemed preferable to waiting passively for his network to escalate their threats into actual violence. We decided to move forward with preparing the civil lawsuit while also implementing security measures to protect Chloe and everyone else who might be targeted. Dr. Vasquez had been consulting with security professionals who specialized in protecting domestic violence survivors from sophisticated stalking networks. When I met with her to discuss Chloe's psychological readiness for another extended legal battle, Elena provided information that changed my entire perspective on the situation. "Natalia, there's something you need to understand about men like Derek and the networks they build in prison," Elena said. "This isn't just about revenge against Chloe, or even against you personally. Derek has become part of a movement that views domestic violence laws and women's rights as fundamental threats to male authority. Chloe has become a symbol to them, and stopping Derek's harassment of her has become a larger battle about whether women can safely leave abusive relationships." "You're saying this has become bigger than just our family situation?" "Much bigger. The network Derek has joined includes men who've been planning coordinated attacks against domestic violence shelters, legal aid organizations that help abuse survivors, and law enforcement officers who specialize in domestic violence cases. You and Chloe aren't just dealing with one angry ex-husband anymore. You're dealing with a domestic terrorism network." This revelation forced me to reconsider everything about our situation. Derek hadn't just used his time in prison to plan personal revenge. He'd connected with a movement that viewed people like Chloe, me, Lisa, Elena, and Detective Chen as enemies in a larger war about gender roles and male authority. The security assessment of my apartment revealed vulnerabilities I hadn't considered. The building's entry system could be bypassed by someone with basic technical skills. My daily routines were predictable enough that anyone conducting surveillance could easily determine when I would be alone and vulnerable. Most concerning, the security firm found evidence that someone had already been inside my apartment, possibly multiple times over several months. They didn't take anything or leave obvious signs of their presence, the security consultant explained, but there are subtle indicators that someone has been conducting searches of your personal belongings and documents. They also appear to have installed surveillance equipment that would allow them to monitor your activities and communications. The idea that Derek's associates had been inside my home, going through my personal belongings and watching my daily life, was violating in ways I hadn't expected. It also meant that our plans to protect Chloe might already be compromised, since Derek's network had probably been monitoring our communications and preparations. Chloe's security assessment revealed an even more serious situation. Her apartment had been burglarized twice in recent months, but nothing valuable had been taken. Instead, the intruders had focused on personal items like photographs, mail, and documents that would provide information about her relationships and activities. Most alarmingly, they'd found evidence that someone had been drugging Chloe's food and beverages, probably to make her disoriented and vulnerable to abduction attempts. "How long has this been happening?" I asked when Chloe called to tell me about the security findings. "Months, probably." I kept thinking I was just stressed or not sleeping well, but there were days when I felt dizzy and confused for no apparent reason. I attributed it to work stress and trauma recovery, but now I realize someone was systematically poisoning me. The sophistication of Derek's network was becoming clear. They weren't just conducting surveillance and harassment. They were implementing psychological warfare techniques designed to make Chloe doubt her own perceptions and judgment, while gradually escalating their control over her environment. Lisa Park had been working with federal investigators to map out the full extent of Derek's prison network, and their findings were disturbing. The group included more than 30 incarcerated men serving time for domestic violence, stalking, and related charges. They'd established connections with outside supporters who provided financial resources, conducted surveillance, and in some cases carried out harassment and intimidation on behalf of the incarcerated members. "This network has been operating for several years," Lisa explained during our strategy meeting. "They've been involved in the harassment of dozens of women across multiple states, as well as threats against law enforcement officers, judges, and attorneys who work on domestic violence cases." "Why hasn't this been stopped?" "Because they've been very careful to avoid crossing lines that would trigger federal terrorism investigations. Most of their activities fall into legal gray areas where they're clearly intimidating and harassing people, but not making explicit enough threats to warrant major criminal prosecutions. Until now," quote, "Derek's recent letter to you, combined with the evidence of surveillance and drugging attempts against Chloe, gives us grounds for a federal conspiracy case that could take down the entire network." The federal investigation moved quickly once prosecutors understood the scope and sophistication of Derek's network. Search warrants were executed simultaneously at locations across 6 states, targeting both incarcerated network members and their outside associates. The evidence seized included detailed surveillance files on dozens of domestic violence survivors, financial records showing systematic funding of harassment activities, and communications proving coordination between prison inmates and outside actors. Derek's reaction to the federal investigation was immediate and revealing. He demanded to speak with me, claiming that he had information that could help the investigation in exchange for consideration in his own case. When I declined to meet with him, Derek began making threats through his attorney that demonstrated how completely he'd lost touch with reality. Derek claimed that he'd been conducting legitimate research into the legal system that had wrongfully convicted him, and that any surveillance or harassment activities were actually justified investigations into the people who'd conspired to destroy his marriage and his life. He threatened to expose what he called a feminist conspiracy to use false domestic violence allegations to destroy innocent men. Most disturbing was Derek's claim that he was part of a larger movement that would eventually restore proper relationships between men and women, with women returning to their traditional roles as obedient wives and mothers. He spoke about Chloe as if she were a runaway slave who needed to be returned to her proper owner, and about me as if I were a race traitor who'd betrayed my own family for political purposes. The federal prosecutors decided to offer Derek a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for information about his network's activities and plans. Derek's response was to fire his attorney and represent himself, apparently believing that he could convince a jury that his actions were justified by his status as a wrongfully persecuted husband and brother. The trial lasted 3 weeks and provided a disturbing window into the mindset of men who viewed domestic violence as a legitimate tool for maintaining control over women. Derek's defense was that he'd never intended to harm Chloe, only to help her understand her proper role as his wife. He claimed that his threats and stalking were actually expressions of love and concern, and that the legal system had misinterpreted his actions because of anti-male bias. Derek's testimony revealed the extent to which he'd constructed an alternate reality where he was the victim, and Chloe, me, and everyone who'd helped her were the villains. He spoke about our family history in ways that bore no resemblance to my memories, describing himself as a protective older brother and devoted husband who'd been betrayed by the people he'd tried to help. Most chilling was Derek's description of his plans for the future. He spoke confidently about his eventual release from prison and his intention to restore his relationship with Chloe. He described detailed scenarios where Chloe would realize her mistakes and return to him willingly, apologizing for the trouble she'd caused and accepting her proper role as his wife. When the prosecutor asked Derek what he would do if Chloe refused to reconcile with him, Derek's response was immediate and frightening. "That's not possible," he said. "Chloe belongs with me. That's just a fact of nature. If she's confused about that, it's because other people have been filling her head with lies. Once those people are out of the picture, she'll remember who she really is." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Derek was sentenced to an additional life term without parole, to be served concurrently with his existing sentence. More importantly, the other members of his network received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years, effectively dismantling the organization that had been terrorizing domestic violence survivors across multiple states. Chloe attended Derek's sentencing hearing, something she hadn't done during his original trial. She'd wanted to face him directly and make sure he understood that his actions had consequences that went beyond legal punishment. "I want him to see what I look like when I'm not afraid of him," she told me before the hearing. "I want him to understand that he doesn't control my life anymore, and that he never will again." When Derek saw Chloe in the courtroom, his reaction was immediate and disturbing. He began shouting about how beautiful she looked and how proud he was that she'd maintained herself properly during their separation. He spoke to her as if they were still married, as if the trial and imprisonment had been minor inconveniences that didn't change their fundamental relationship. Security officers had to physically restrain Derek when he attempted to approach Chloe during a break in the proceedings. Even while being handcuffed and removed from the courtroom, Derek continued shouting declarations of love and promises that he would wait for her, no matter how long it took. "He still doesn't understand," Chloe said afterward. "Even now, even after everything that's happened, he still thinks I belong to him. Do you think he'll ever understand?" And I'm finally okay with that. I spent years trying to make Derek see me as a human being, instead of as his property. I realize now that it was never possible, because seeing me as human would have required him to change everything about how he views himself and the world. The aftermath of Derek's final sentencing brought a kind of closure I hadn't expected. The federal investigation had exposed and dismantled a network that had been terrorizing domestic violence survivors for years. Derek would spend the rest of his life in maximum security prison, with no possibility of parole, and extremely limited contact with the outside world. More importantly, Chloe was finally free to build the life she wanted without constantly looking over her shoulder. She married her fiancé 6 months after Derek's sentencing, in a small ceremony attended by people who'd supported her journey, from victim to survivor, to independent woman building her own future. I attended the wedding and watched Chloe dance with her new husband, laughing and relaxed in ways I'd never seen during her marriage to Derek. Her transformation from the terrified woman who'd appeared at my door at 5 in the morning to the confident professional who'd testified against a domestic terrorism network was remarkable. But it hadn't happened overnight. Dr. Vasquez had worked with Chloe for more than 3 years, helping her process the trauma of her relationship with Derek, while also developing the psychological tools she needed to build healthy relationships with other people. The process had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had ultimately allowed Chloe to reclaim her sense of self-worth and personal agency. The most important thing Chloe learned, Elena told me at the wedding reception, was that Derek's view of her had never been based on who she actually was. He'd created a fantasy version of her that existed only in his mind, and all of his anger and violence had been directed at her failure to live up to that fantasy. How do you recover from something like that? By remembering that you were never the problem. Derek's inability to see Chloe as a full human being was a limitation in him, not a failure in her. Once she understood that, she could stop trying to earn his respect and start building relationships with people who were capable of seeing and appreciating who she really was. Lisa Park had used the Derek Patterson case as the foundation for a legal practice that specialized in dismantling domestic violence networks before they could escalate to serious violence. She'd identified patterns in how incarcerated abusers built support systems and coordinated harassment campaigns, and she'd developed strategies for interrupting those networks through civil litigation and federal prosecution. The Derek Patterson network wasn't unique. Lisa explained at a conference on domestic violence prevention where she'd been invited to speak. There are similar organizations operating in prisons across the country, and they're becoming more sophisticated in their methods and more ambitious in their targets. What can be done to prevent these networks from forming? Education, monitoring, and early intervention. Prison officials need to understand how these networks operate and what warning signs to look for. Law enforcement needs resources to investigate interstate stalking and harassment. And survivors need support systems that can help them identify and respond to escalating threats before they become life-threatening. Detective Chen had used his retirement to consult with law enforcement agencies on domestic violence cases that involved sophisticated stalking and surveillance techniques. The Derek Patterson case had become a model for how to build strong, prosecutable cases against abusers who use technology and networks to continue terrorizing their victims, even when traditional restraining orders and imprisonment hadn't stopped their behavior. The most important lesson from the Patterson case, James told me during one of our periodic conversations, was that domestic violence doesn't end when the abuser is arrested or even when they're sent to prison. Men like Derek view imprisonment as a temporary setback, not as a consequence that should change their behavior. So how do you actually stop them? By treating domestic violence as what it really is: terrorism directed at intimate partners. When we started investigating Derek's network as a terrorist organization rather than as individual domestic violence cases, we were able to use federal resources and legal tools that aren't available for traditional domestic violence prosecution. Tony Martinez had parlayed his work on the Derek Patterson case into a security consulting business that specialized in protecting domestic violence survivors from sophisticated stalking networks. His clients included women who'd escaped from relationships with men connected to Derek's network, as well as law enforcement officers and legal professionals who'd been targeted for helping domestic violence survivors. The technology available to stalkers has become incredibly sophisticated, Tony explained when I hired him to conduct periodic security reviews of my own situation. GPS tracking, social media monitoring, facial recognition software, even drones for surveillance. The tools that were once available only to law enforcement and intelligence agencies are now accessible to anyone with a few $1,000s and basic technical knowledge. How do ordinary people protect themselves against that level of surveillance? They can't. Not by themselves. Protection from sophisticated stalking requires professional security measures, legal intervention, and community support networks. The days when changing your phone number and moving to a new address provided adequate protection are long gone. 5 years after Derek's final sentencing, I received a notification from the Federal Bureau of Prisons that Derek had died in custody. He'd apparently suffered a heart attack during what prison officials described as an altercation with another inmate. The official report provided minimal details, noting only that Derek had been found unconscious in his cell and had died despite medical intervention. I felt nothing when I read the notification. Not relief, not sadness, not closure. Just a kind of hollow acknowledgement that a chapter of my life that had been painful and complicated was finally over. I called Chloe to let her know about Derek's death before she heard about it through other channels. Her reaction was similar to mine. "I should probably feel something," she said, "but Derek stopped being real to me years ago. He'd become more like a character in a nightmare than an actual person. Learning that the nightmare is over doesn't make me happy or sad. It just makes the world feel a little bit safer." Chloe had built a life that Derek could never have imagined or approved of. She'd become the director of a nonprofit organization that provided legal advocacy for domestic violence survivors. She and her husband had adopted 2 children from foster care, kids who'd been removed from abusive homes and needed families who understood trauma and recovery. Derek always talked about the children we would have together. Chloe told me when she announced the adoptions. He had this fantasy about raising sons who would grow up to be like him, and daughters who would be perfectly obedient. The idea that I might want to help children who'd been damaged by men like Derek would have been incomprehensible to him. "Do you think about him much anymore?" "Only when I'm working with clients who remind me of who I used to be. I see women who are terrified and convinced that they're trapped, and I remember what it felt like to believe that Derek's version of reality was the only truth available. I try to help them understand that there are other possibilities, other ways of living." "What do you tell them?" "That healing is possible, but it takes time and support, and sometimes it requires you to make choices that feel impossible. That the men who hurt them aren't going to change, no matter how much they promise or how sincere they seem. And that building a new life after abuse isn't just about getting away from the abuser. It's about remembering who you were before they convinced you that you were worthless." Marcus had been dead for 7 years when Derek died, but I still visited his grave regularly to update him on how things were progressing. The cemetery had become a place where I could process complicated emotions without having to perform strength or competence for other people. Standing beside Marcus's headstone, I told him about Derek's death and about the network of people who'd worked together to protect Chloe and stop Derek's escalating violence. I told him about the legal precedents that had been established, the security techniques that had been developed, and the community resources that had been created to help other families in similar situations. "You would be proud of what we built," I said to the granite marker. "It wasn't pretty and it wasn't easy, but we managed to turn Derek's hatred into something useful. We protected people, we stopped violence, and we proved that decent people can win against predators if they're willing to work together and accept the costs." I thought about the lesson Marcus had taught me, about the difference between being safe and being decent, and about the choices that define who we become. Derek had chosen violence, control, and ultimately terrorism. Chloe had chosen survival, recovery, and service to other survivors. I had chosen to use my resources and connections to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The costs had been significant. I'd lost my brother, though I'd really lost him years before his death, when he'd chosen to become someone I couldn't recognize or respect. I'd spent years dealing with legal proceedings, security concerns, and the psychological toll of being targeted by a domestic terrorism network. I'd learned things about human nature and violence that I would never be able to forget, but I'd also learned things about resilience, community, and the power of people working together to protect each other. I'd seen Chloe transform from victim to survivor to advocate. I'd watched Lisa, Elena, James, Tony, and dozens of other professionals dedicate their careers to preventing domestic violence and supporting survivors. I'd been part of building systems that would protect people long after Derek was gone. Walking away from Marcus's grave that day, I thought about the conversation he and I had never had, the one where he would have asked me if the costs had been worth the results. I knew what my answer would have been. Some fights are worth having even when you know they're going to cost you everything you thought you wanted from life. Some people are worth protecting even when protecting them puts you in danger. And some victories are worth achieving even when they leave you changed in ways you can never undo. Derek had spent his entire adult life trying to control and terrorize women who refused to accept his authority over them. In the end, he died in prison, forgotten by everyone except the people who'd worked to stop him, and the systems that had been built to prevent future Derek Pattersons from hurting the people they claimed to love. Chloe had spent years being terrorized by Derek, but she'd survived him and built something meaningful from the wreckage of their relationship. She was raising children who would grow up understanding that love was about respect and support rather than control and violence. She was helping other women escape from relationships that would have destroyed them if they'd stayed. I had spent years learning how to fight monsters like Derek, and I discovered that the fight was worth having even when the monsters were members of your own family. The brother I'd loved was gone, but the community of people dedicated to protecting domestic violence survivors would continue the work long after all of us were gone. That was Marcus's real legacy and Derek's final defeat. The decency Marcus had modeled and taught had multiplied across generations and communities, while Derek's hatred had died with him in a prison cell, leaving nothing behind except the systems we'd built to prevent others like him from destroying the people they claimed to love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.